Hey guys, your Poetry Skill Builder this week was on theme, and we looked at the poem The Rainy Day by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, there's actually going to be two videos to this set because I was scrounging around online and found something really cool that I think you guys would be interested in. So if you'll stick with me through the first video, we'll get into some really cool stuff in the second one. Both pretty short though. So it's been a few days since we've read the poem, so we need to go back and take a look at it. So first off, we have three stanzas, one here, here, and here. And now remember that each stanza should develop its own kind of central idea or central message. So the first thing I want to do is go over some of the vocabulary with you in this poem, because after my first reading of a poem where I just get that emotional reaction, I always start breaking down some of the author's word choice. Because there's so few words in a poem, each one can be really important. And guys, you can Google these just like I do. When I read a poem or have the dictionary out with me. The only time you can't do that is on a test, and usually there's enough context clues to help you figure them out. So the first word that we have is weary. Weary means tired. You might be weary after a long journey. And then we have the moldering wall. So it's talking about a vine that's clinging to the moldering wall. So I picture an old garden wall made out of stone and has a vine creeping up it. But sometimes when we let a vine creep up onto a wall, it will actually start to break down the wall. So moldering means to crumble or decay because of neglect. So I picture that the gardener hasn't been cutting down those vines in a while, and it's tearing down the beautiful rock wall. Now later in stanza 2, we see the moldering past, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, we also see the word dreary, which means dull or lifeless. So he's talking about his life and his day being cold and dark and dreary. So he's calling his day dull and unexciting. And if we look at our last stanza, the last two words I want to talk to you guys about are cease and repining. So sometimes you've heard the word cease as in cease fire in a battle or a war, and that means stop firing, stop shooting, okay? Repining means you're complaining or you're longing for something else. So here in the last stanza, he's talking to his heart, and he said, cease repining or stop longing for something else. Okay, now that we have a pretty good handle on the vocabulary, I'm going to leave that vocabulary up on the side for you as we read the poem, guys. But let's go back through all three stanzas and kind of break it down as we go. The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary. So in our first two lines of stanza 1, he's giving us the setting. It's cold, it's dark, it's dreary. The wind is never weary, meaning the wind never gets tired, it never stops. So it doesn't sound exactly like the best day out in the park. It's a hard day that you kind of just want to be curled up in a blanket and hide from the world, okay? The vine still clings or still holds to the moldering wall, but at every gust, the dead leaves fall. So we have this image of the vine on the wall or the garden rock wall, and the wall is starting to break down and decay. And it said with every gust of wind, the dead leaves on the vine are falling. So it's not a pretty green vine. It's a dying vine that's breaking down the wall underneath it. So nothing's really holding very strongly. It's not beautiful. It's a pretty dark and dreary day, so much so that the poet repeats it in the last line of the stanza. So, red flag, when a poet ever repeats something, it must be a pretty important image. So again, we have that cold, dark, dreary day twice now. So our first stanza, let's sum it up. It's all about darkness and decay, and it kind of leaves us with this sense of loss, okay? Now let's move on to the second stanza. My life is cold and dark and dreary. So we're starting out with that same kind of melody to the words and that darkness. And it says it rains and the wind is never weary. So the wind still won't stop. It feels like he just can't get a good sunny day. My thoughts still cling to the moldering past. So instead of repeating that third line that we have in the first stanza, we're not talking about a vine anymore, we're talking about his thoughts. And it said the thoughts are clinging to the moldering past instead of the vine clinging to the wall. So thoughts aren't really a living thing that can hold on to something. So we know he means this kind of as a comparison, okay? And if his thoughts are clinging to something, they're holding on to something, he said they're holding on to the moldering or the decaying past. So it sounds like his past has had something pretty dark in it, and he is holding on to it with his thoughts, and he just can't seem to get past whatever that event was that's hurt him, that's become so dark. So think about something that is really emotional for you and how that feeling can kind of stick with you, okay? But the hopes of youth fall thick in the blast. Okay, so the blast could be two things here. It could be the blast of the wind that's blowing the leaves, or it could be a blast like in a battle. You can kind of take your pick because the result is the same. His hope from his youth or his younger days, again in the past, is falling in the blast. So like the leaves fall here, in the wind, his hope is just kind of falling to the ground. It's not lasting, it's not growing. He doesn't have a whole lot of hope. Okay? And the days are dark and dreary. So let's move on to the third stanza. Be still, sad heart. Okay, so he's no longer talking to the reader, he's talking to his own heart. And cease repining. He's telling it to stop longing. He's telling it to get out of this past that he's stuck in. Behind the clouds is the sun still shining. So we have behind the clouds, the sun is still shining. That's the direct opposite of what he has been saying in both of our other stanzas where it talks about the cold and the dark and the dreariness. He said, thy fate is the common fate of all. Thy is an old way of saying you, so he's still talking to his heart. You have the fate that's not different than anyone else. We all deal with this. So into each life some rain must fall. He's saying that this is just the way it is. In every life, there's going to be some rainy days. Some days must be dark and dreary. Some days must be bad and painful, but it's important to remember that the sun is still shining behind the clouds. So he talks about the day in stanza 1, and then he talks about his life in stanza 2, and how his life is just like this cold, rainy day that's inspired him outside. And then in the third stanza, he talks about his life as a whole and what he should kind of do with that emotion of feeling so dark that he needs to still have faith that the hope and the sun are still shining behind all of that. So how can we sum that up in one line that would be our theme or our lesson? You can kind of choose your wording, but essentially it should be something along the lines of every life has to have some hard times, but the sun is still shining behind the clouds, or but there's still hope for all of us. Okay? Now your question at the bottom asks you to use details from the poem to support your answer. Okay, so anything that we highlighted here would be good evidence, or you could use the specific images like the vine clinging to the wall and his thoughts clinging to the past. Definitely comparing the sun still shining behind the cloud with its opposite of the cold and dark and dreary day. And notice again, we have the progression of the day, then talking about his whole life, and then talking about it's only some days that are very dark. Okay, so there's still hope there. Now, if you'll stick with me and come back for the second video, I'll show you the secrets behind why he wrote some of these lines.